All right, welcome back. We are diving deep into natural building. This is class number 2. If you are able to download the slides that go along with this class, I highly suggest it because there's going to be a lot of pictures that we're referencing. All right, let's get started. First question, how long have people been using natural materials for building? Some of the oldest structures that are been found date back almost 5,000, over 5,000 years ago. As the slide here will show you, the one on the left is an actual house that was built in and burned in with stone, and it was built 3,600 BC. It's in Scotland, and it's made of stone, sod, and they are assuming that it had a thatch roof, which is part of their tradition there. The one in the middle is over 5,600 years old. It's a temple. It was built, somewhere 3,600 BC, and parts of it were built in 2,500 BC. It's in the Mediterranean area, and they actually used limestone and wood from what they're finding. Then the next picture there is a building that's over 4,500 years old. It's also a temple. It's in Egypt, and it was made out of actually mud bricks and stone, so it's a combination of both. So some of these buildings, as you can see, some of the first building materials we used were materials that we found on the earth, primarily stone. So after we left the caves and we started to need to shelter ourselves, most of the people who built for themselves used what they had. So that's really important part of natural building. Let's go to the next slide. How long can natural buildings last? So I get this question a lot. Actually, one of the oldest standing buildings is about 3,350 years old. The original building was rediscovered in the early 1900s, and then the community rebuilt the actual temple. It's a mosque, and it's in Africa, and they used the adobe bricks and the clay from the land, so they were able to rebuild that same existing temple. So part of it is 3,350 years old, but a lot of it is also relatively new, over 500 years old. The picture, that's the picture in the middle. So the picture on the left here is it's also a temple. It's built with sun-dried bricks. This is the oldest sun-dried brick building in the world that's still standing. It's over 4,700 years old. It's also in Egypt. And then the coolest thing about it is there's this actual city. They call it the mud brick skyscrapers, and it's in Yemen, and it was built at 300 AD, so it's over 2,300 years old. And it's still standing. It's still being used. People are living in these, and they go up to 6 to 7 stories high. And some of those walls from the very bottom are extremely wide to take the load of all these tall, mud bricks and cob to support the framing, to support the structure, to support all the different levels in those skyscrapers. All right, let's move on to the next slide. The other question I get is, how do people maintain these old natural buildings? So one of the main things that people do in these countries that are still using these buildings is they actually take care of them on an annual basis, or every 2 years, or even every 5 years, depending on what's needed. So they look for cracks. That's one of the things that happen, just because in the areas where they live, it's dry primarily. And so as the clay starts to dry, it'll crack. So if they're not using straw, that's kind of a normal part of it. So it depends on their soil and their content. So first things they do, the cracks. Then the other part that's done every few years is replacing the plaster. So they'll add a skim coat of plaster on top to be able to protect the building. So every 2 to 3 years, they'll just replaster it, and it's actually done by the community. A lot of these buildings are, temples or mosques. So for them to be able to kind of make a day out of it, and they just get the clay from the, or the mud from the land, and they rehydrate it and then replaster the building so it keeps it fresh and keeps it new and keeps it vibrating. The other part is also adding thickness to the walls as they build up. So in those skyscrapers that we were talking about earlier, the walls are so thick because as they go up to each layer, they're able to add more of a foundation on the bottom. So some of those walls were 3 to 4 feet deep. So you have to imagine how many times they had to add that thickness to the wall to support it. So as it's almost like a pyramid, they're building it up, but it's actually moving towards the top, and the walls are supporting all the weight that's coming towards the top. So as one of the stories that Yanto likes to tell is that in these structures, they start off, building a home for their daughter and their husband. It's on the ground level. And then as they have kids, there'll be a second story, and then there'll be a third story as their kids grow up. And then the bottom will turn into like a store or a shop, and then everyone else will move up a floor. And by the time you get to the third or fourth floor, you're talking about multi-generational families living in that structure, and it grows with the family. So it's a really beautiful concept and understanding that they have for their buildings. All right, moving on to the next slide. Another question is, when did natural materials for buildings stop being widely used? So this is a really good question. Since we have been building with natural materials for thousands of years, as you can see, there had to have been a point where that became not cool anymore, or that became something that people were not doing. But it's actually not true, because there's still about 30% of the world that still live in natural homes. So us being in the United States, where there isn't a lot of natural buildings or not a lot of earth homes, it's not something that we see on a daily basis. But as you go to different countries, especially third world countries, well, they still live in these kind of structures. And it just really depends on the area. It depends on where they live and what materials are available. So that's kind of, still very much available for you to go see natural buildings around the world. But going back to the question, when did it start to change? When did that industry start change? When did people stop using mud to build walls? Well, it really kind of started happening around the 1600s, where wood logging industry kind of began. And in Europe and certain parts of Asia, there was an abundance of lumber. And so that lumber became something that they ended up using for their structures and their buildings. They also incorporated clay and mud and adobe as part of the structure to protect, to skin the walls, to plaster, to do things like that. But it no longer needed to be a monolithic, all solid stone or all solid clay walls. Now they started to incorporate lumber with it. And then in America, when they came across and they saw how much lumber there was here, that was also an opportunity for all the pilgrims and all the people coming from Europe, that they had already started building with wood. But because in Europe, wood is not as an abundant source as it is here in the United States, the settlers started using wood a whole lot more than they started using the clay or the earth. The biggest change probably came during the transportation of timbers through railroad. So this is in the 1800s, when they were able to transport lumber from a high timber area to an area that didn't have a lot of timbers, like big cities like Chicago, New York, and areas like that. And they were able to start building their buildings with the timber. And then the biggest change of all came during the 1950s through the GI Bill, which led to a massive housing boom. And that, what ended up happening there is, after World War II, the soldiers came back, and the government promised them to have money to be able to build their own home, to have the American dream. And so a lot of people started building their own homes. And the craftsman, the art of the craftsman, the carpenter, before that time, well, that craftsman was renowned. So if you see some of the old buildings from the early 1900s and the late 1800s, the Victorians, the bungalows, well, there's a lot of craftsmanship that goes into those structures. So they were paid well. It was an industry. They were renowned. They were looked upon as a very skilled labor. And then during the 1940s, 1950s, then they started to basically mass produce lumber, dimensional lumber specifically. They were able to start using different building techniques to be able to speed up the process of building. They were trying to make housing more affordable. And then that really changed the way a house was built. And so it no longer became this beautiful craftsman style home with all these amazing details. It was basically the beginning of the moving out of the city into the subdivisions, and then subdivisions popping up all over the country and around the world as well, to be able to make mass production of homes to give people opportunity to live in their own and build their own home. And a lot of the soldiers who came back and there wasn't work, well, they picked up the trade of working in these basically factories, home factories, that were called subdivisions. And so they were able to come in, join the workforce, and be able to, with little amount of experience, be able to join the manufacturing of these subdivisions through the evolution of the lumber industry. And so part of that, in the 1950s, the building codes got updated. So they hadn't been updated probably since the early 1900s, to focus on safety and building practices. And the main reason was because there were so many houses being built, and they were being built so fast that there wasn't really anybody approving them. There wasn't anyone really looking at the structural components of it to see if they're actually going to last, if they're going to be able to withstand the hurricanes of central U.S. or the hurricanes of the East Coast or the tornadoes, just basically anywhere. Obviously not hurricanes in the central, but hurricanes around the coastal areas and tornadoes in the central area. That's what I meant to say. But those houses were being blown away. They weren't being able to sustain some of the most basic windstorms. So then the government decided that they needed to have some oversight over all the buildings. And then at that point, there was a huge lobbying movement by the milling industry, by the forestry industry, to be able to make some of these wood products as standard into the construction. So it was really at that point where the concept of building in a natural building, in a home that breathes, kind of left the consciousness of humanity at that point. And we started to get into, well, how fast can we build it? How affordable can we build it? And that's when the industry also started to create new products like drywall, some of the toxic siding materials that they were using, some of the things that were used with chemicals that, again, during the World War II, those chemical companies had to do something else. So they jumped right into the building industry, and they started to use some of these chemicals to put into insulation, into siding, into like asbestos, basically, lead paint. A lot of these things came through that era up to the 1970s. All right, let's move on. Are there natural buildings all over the world? The quick answer to that is yes. There's natural buildings all over the world, and mainly because there are two basic rules that most people use to build. One is use what you have. So in different areas, they use what they have. So it's important for you, when you visit some of these countries, to check out some of the old buildings and how they were built. The other rule is build for what you need. So a lot of these countries, they build the houses for the sizes that they need. That they're not building for generations. As the family grows, they also grow. Their homes grow. So that's what basically add on as you need it. And then when they're done with their home, they usually just leave, and the home just goes back to the earth, especially in a lot of these third world countries. Or somebody will come in and move into the home and take over. So it isn't something that's looked upon like it is in the United States and other industrial world, where it's like this home is an asset and it's going to appreciate and you're going to get tax deferments and you have all these things. There, it's a home. It's a basic home, and it satisfies your needs of staying warm in the cool air, it's staying cool in the hot sun, shelter when it's cold and rainy, and gives you an opportunity, a place to cook and to live and to rest and to be protected from nature and its elements. Every country has a past, so look, ask, and then mimic how they use to build. So it's important for whenever you're into a different country, especially for me, because I love buildings, I always like to see and ask, how are the indigenous people who were living here before? How are the European people building here before? So it's kind of, there's progressions of the history of each country. So it's good to go back to its indigenous people, and then from there move on to the modern age and how it was developed, the building industry there. All right, let's move on. How do these natural buildings differ from each other in different bioregions? So we'll start off with the desert areas. So desert homes. So there's lots of different ways to build natural buildings in the desert. Here's 4 of the main ones that I came up with. There's rammed earth, there's cob homes, there's earth ships, and then there's earth bags. What these all have in common is they are cool during the day and they're warm at night. And mainly because in the desert area, when it's at night, it's cold. So the thermal mass, which is another element there, the thermal mass absorbs that coolness during the night, and then during the night, yes. And then during the day, when it's hot outside, that coolness is relieved from the walls into the building, and then you're able to stay cool. And then the opposite is happening during the day, because now those walls are absorbing the sun. But then by the time the cool air comes, the sun goes down and now it's a little bit cooler, that warmth in the walls is now relieved and brought into the home. A lot of the homes also in the desert use passive solar design. So to absorb that winter sun when it's low, they have big eaves to protect it from the sun in the summer. They have windows that are facing south, so that when the sun is low, it comes in through the windows, and ideally it not only warms up the walls, but it also warms up your floor. If you have an earthen floor or a concrete floor or a tile floor, whatever it is, it's absorbing the thermal mass on the floor of that heat, and then again it's releasing that at night. Most of these are sustainable. They're built with materials from the desert, so there's an abundance of clay or sand. Usually, again, use what you have that's available there. The great concept of earth ships, I'm sure you guys have researched it, know a lot about it, but another great part of these buildings is that they harvest their own water, they harvest their own energy with the sun. Just, being in the desert, you have an abundance of sun, so passive solar and solar energy is an important concept to have. Water retainment underneath the homes, cisterns. So a lot of great stuff in the earthship design concept that you can incorporate into the cob or the rammed earth or the earth bag. The next building is the earth bags. Again, they have thermal mass concept as well as the rammed earth and the cob and the earth ships. The other added benefit of the earth bags is a lot of times they are built with domes. So it's really great for wind. And then I don't know if you guys have been into the desert, but when you're in the desert, it can get super windy. They can have random windstorms coming through. So protecting your home from that is really important. All right, so that's desert homes. Let's move on to tropical areas. So in tropical areas, there's an abundance of bamboo. So a lot of times the indigenous people or the people of old, they would use bamboo for structure. So modern architects, modern technology is catching up to that, and they're having some amazing, beautiful structures being built out of bamboo. They're seeing how durable it is, how powerful and strong it is for retention, for compression, for shear, and so they're able to use bamboo in most of the structures in the tropical areas. Basically, in tropical areas, you don't need to have thick walls. And a lot of people think, well, if you have thick walls, then you're able to stay cooler. But the case is that when you're making homes with earthen materials, the thicker the wall, the longer it takes to dry. And the humidity in the tropical areas really never allow your wall to dry. So you have to go in with 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch plaster layers and then add them on as they dry and not do it all at once. one of the things that we did when we were in Costa Rica is we wanted to make a cob oven, and we were there for about 4 weeks, I think, or maybe 6 weeks, and we started off during the first week building the base of the cob oven, and by the time we left, it had never dried. So we were like, cob oven's not a very good idea in the tropical areas. Then the other concept is obviously the foundation needs to be lifted up off the ground, because a lot of times in the tropical area you'll have driving rains, driving winds, and you'll have water that is in abundance that will flow. The other part of it is that because it is always moist, you need to be able to have the airflow underneath your home so that it doesn't create any pockets where mold or rodents or ants or any of these creatures that live in the jungle and that or in tropical areas can use your house as their shelter. So you want to make sure that you have airflow underneath your house. So most of these homes are built up on the ground with decks, and then also they have a lot of windows, so it allows the wind to come in and out. So that's really important for tropical areas, just because you don't really, if you don't have electricity or air conditioning is just really not an option. It's really like important to have that airflow, because in the shade it is cool. Under the canopy of the tropical areas, it actually is cool as long as you're protected from the sun. So they use thatch roofs or the metal roofs, and there's no insulation again in the roofs. If you go to these houses, you'll see the beams, which are either bamboo or locally milled lumber, and you'll be able to see the metal roof right there and there. And they just do screens for mosquitoes and screens for bugs, and then that's it. And then the airflow, everything else around it. If you are going to use lumber, it's important to check in with the indigenous people there or local builders, because not every lumber is good to use, especially because in the tropical area there are bugs that we don't know of. And so if you build with a lumber that a bug loves, your house is not going to last very long. There are very strong, hardy lumbers in those tropical areas as well that had been used for building, but because they're so strong and so resistant, they're also been over harvested. So it's important for you also to check before you start harvesting trees, which are the trees that are protected or should be protected. And really, there's no need, because bamboo grows like grass, literally. It's a grass and it's abundant, and so it's really important just to use that, because it will grow super quick. In less than a year and a half, you'll have a bamboo that's like this big. So it's crazy. I wish we could build with bamboo here. Okay, so that's the last area bioregion we'll talk about is the cold and rainy areas. It's kind of funny that a lot of people say, oh, well, cob doesn't do good in cold and rainy areas because of the wetness. And as we know, if you wet soil, it'll just turn back into mud. So, but that's actually not true. If you build your house properly, if you have a good foundation, you have good drainage, you have your boots, and your hat, the drift snow that stays on the building isn't going to do much to the cob, especially if it has a lime plaster on the outside, or even if it has an earth plaster. Really, it's so thick and so well, it breathes and maintains moisture so well that it doesn't really affect it very much. The problem with cob is if you are building in a flooded area where you're in a floodplain, that's something you would have to consider and worry about. That's probably the only place I wouldn't build with cob. Okay, so cob is great for cold areas. It's great for rainy areas. The other aspect is the straw bales. Building with straw bales, because it's cold and rainy, having that high insulation is important. And also cob and fireplaces, it's great because the cob really can absorb that heat throughout the day. So once you move into a cob building in the wintertime and you're firing up your wood stove every day, you're actually putting that heat, that battery that we were talking about, that thermal mass is being absorbed into the walls. And so then at night when you go to bed, that heat is released back into your home. So it really equalizes the temperature for the day and for the night. A cool thing that you guys should take a look at is the European masonry stove. It's a great concept. A lot of people are doing it with cob. Traditionally, it was done with bricks. in Europe. But basically what it is it's a box with tubing for the fire to go through, and as the smoke is going through these chambers, it's actually heating up all the stone, the brick, the cob all around it, so it's absorbing that. So you can do one big giant fire, and this European masonry stove will absorb that heat and then release it throughout the day. And then it's really cool if you go to the outside and you see what actually comes out of the pipes. Instead of it being smoke, it becomes steam because all of it gets used up. So it's a really cool concept. All right, we'll go on to the next slide. What are some of the different natural building techniques found around the world? So here's a list of them. We'll go through each of these one by one, but you can kind of take a look. There's cob, adobe, earth bags, straw bale, bamboo, hempcrete, rammed earth, cordwood, Paja-Reque, wattle and daub, round wood, and log homes. I'm sure there's probably, another one that should probably be on here would be stone homes, obviously, but I kind of ran out of room, so we'll move on. All right, let's start off with cob. So what is cob? Cob is basically clay, sand, straw, and water. The clay acts as the glue. The sand acts as compression. Again, we talked about that last class. When the clay is drying, it wants to pull apart, and the straw and the sand keeps it from pulling apart because it's trying to compress itself. The straw acts like the tensile strength. So tensile strength is basically like the rebar. So when the straw is intertwined together with the clay and you try to pull it apart, it makes it really hard. So a lot of times when we do some testing for the cob, is we'll mix the straw, we'll mix in the clay and the sand and the water, and then once we feel like it's all mixed really well, especially with our feet, we'll pick up a bundle, we'll kind of turn it into a loaf, and then we'll squeeze it and try to pull it apart. And if it pulls apart really easy, that means there's not enough straw. If it pulls apart with a little bit of resistance, it's a pretty good amount. If it pulls apart or it doesn't pull apart, then that's a lot of straw. So, and it depends on what you want to do and how much straw you have available to you. So it could be used on its own, or it could be used with other materials. So cob is it's structural building. It could be for structural building. It's really cool. One of the things that you can look up is that there's tests that they do for cob in seismic areas. And so there was a test that was done in Peru where they put the cob building on a shake test. And what they saw when they turned it into slow motion was the cob turned into jello-like form, where it was like it was just mimicking like the way jello moves on a table. And so what they found out is that cob is actually very fluid in that sense, that once it starts shaking that direction, it actually just all moves together as one monolithic system. They found a couple things that they thought that would help with that, because it lasted to about 6 point something before they started seeing some cracks. The more straw that they add, there was less cracks. They got that up, I think, to 7 point something. And then when they started to incorporate bamboo stakes and weaving around it as kind of like a basket inside the cob, that even gave it higher. It was almost going up to 8 with almost no cracks. So it was pretty impressive. Structural cracks. I mean, obviously there's fine cracks for the plaster, but structural cracks means cracks that are going to cause the building to fall on itself. So again, cob is not good for flood zones. So it's important to know where you're building so you don't build in an area where you're going to be underwater. Let's move on to the next one. Adobe. So adobe is basically sun-dried clay bricks. The clay, again, acts like the glue. The sand is for the compression, so it keeps it from falling apart, turning into dust. If they use straw, the straw is the tensile strength. Some adobe are built with straw and some are not. So it just really depends on the bioregion and the availability of straw. It can be used on its own, or it can be used with other materials. It is structural building material, and again, it's not good for flood zones. So that's adobe. Earth bags. Earth bags are made with polyurethane bags typically. You can use other kinds of bags, but it's not really recommended. As if you use burlap for your earth bags, it can deteriorate, especially if there is moisture in the walls. And as we know, if it's cool inside or hot inside and cool outside, or hot outside, there can be condensation, and so your burlap will be absorbing that condensation. And if it isn't able to release it enough time, there can be mold that grows into it, or mildew, or anything that starts deteriorating the process and turning that into a composting product. So polyurethane bags are not natural. They are manufactured, but it doesn't have that problem. So it's a trade-off. We kind of looking at this concept of trying to build with 80% natural materials. The earth bags kind of fall into that category because the majority of the product inside the earth bags are natural. So, and a lot of times these earth bags are actually made from recycled plastics, and so they're able to take that out of the landfill and put it into a structure. They're filled with clay, lime, cement, and it's sometimes they use soil. Sometimes, depending on, they'll use lava rock for insulation, or they'll use aggregate rock from nearby, from the rivers. So, and it just gets filled in and it gets compacted as you're going. And if you haven't seen earth bags, I would recommend taking a look at it. We'll cover it more in other classes, but it's a pretty cool concept. The sand acts as the compression. It can be used on its own, or it can be used with other materials. It's structural. And again, like we talked about, if you're looking for more of an insulation product, if you're using to build a home in an area that's more cool or hot, and you want more insulation, then you can fill it with lava rock. And that's another concept that we've done. Okay, straw bales. So there can either be wheat or rice, or really any straw bales that you can have in the area, as long as they're not something that can be composting or something that's continuing to break down. So the straw is just actual byproduct of what is given to the animals to eat. It has a high insulation value. So again, we talked about this before, but on its side, it's R24. On wide area, when it's 2 feet wide, it's R50. It could be used with other materials, or it could be used alone. So it could be load bearing. So you could also build this to code. So straw bale is something that's available. Cob is not quite available into code. I mean, depending on where you live and if there is a code. Earth bags also we built to code with earth bags, but we had to use timbers to support it. So earth bags alone. I know that Cal Earth is, in the area where Cal Earth is, they are building earth bags to code, and they're done in the last 5 to 10 years. They've really done a great job of introducing earth bags to the mainstream in that area. So it is something that is done in California, but I'm not sure about outside of California. For straw bales, it needs to be protected from the water. So again, it's not really good in flood areas, but if you build it with stone on the bottom, and then straw bales on top, it should be fine. So we'll move on. Bamboo, as we talked about, it grows fast. It's available in most areas, which I found it crazy that you can actually find bamboo in most areas. I remember talking to someone from Canada and then them telling me that there was an abundance of bamboo growing in their garden. I was just like, crazy. And so with that being said, it may not be the bamboo that is 6 inches wide, but even if it's 2 inches wide, what they do is they'll actually bind them together and then wrap them, and that will become the structural component of the bamboo building, which is really a cool concept. So it doesn't really matter what size of bamboo you have, as long as you're able to treat it for it to not to break down, and you're able to break the nodes and kind of clean the inside with a lime wash or some kind of product that allows the breaking down of the bamboo to continue the sugars on the inside to be able to go away, so there isn't ants or isn't any kind of bugs. So once you treat the bamboo, then you can bind them together depending on the size and use that as a building product, which is really great. It can be used with other materials. It can be load bearing. There's a guy in Colombia who builds bamboo bridges for cars and trucks, which is awesome. What he does is he uses the bamboo, he punctures through all the nodes, he drives a 1/2 inch rebar or some kind of rebar down it, and then he fills it with a cement lime, and then it's part of the structural. So he's using the bamboo as his form to be able to keep all these cement things. And when you look at his bridges and his homes, it's just like unbelievable. It's really great. I love bamboo. So good in areas with water. So if you obviously live in tropical areas or areas with lots of water, humidity, it's great. So bamboo is awesome in tropical areas. So we'll move on. Hempcrete. So this picture here on the right is actually a guy that built a home locally. He did the first hempcrete house to code here in this area, which is really cool. Hempcrete is something that's readily available. It comes from the hemp plant. It does need to be processed, so it's highly processed to be able to break down the fibers. It's a pretty expensive process that happens. If you're able to get it, if you're able to have it, it's an awesome product because it is mixed with lime and compacted inside the walls. And it has a high thermal mass and it also has a high insulation mass. So it's really great product, and it's also absorbing the carbon out of the air, which is really great. And it's a byproduct, something that would normally get thrown away because it's the hemp stock. It could be used with other materials. It cannot be load bearing, so you can't build a hemp house out of just hemp and lime and concrete. You have to have timbers to support it. It's not load bearing. It's for basically infill only. It's also good in areas with water and good in areas with humidity. All right, we'll move on. There's rammed earth. Rammed earth basically has clay, sand, lime, or cement, just depending on your mixture. It's packed between forms and then tamped, and that's where the tamped rammed earth kind of comes from. It can be used with other materials if you like it, or it can be used by itself. It can be load bearing. It gives it a layered look. As you can see in these pictures, it's really beautiful because you can use different colors of clay as you start to go up the wall, and it kind of gives you that ocean sunset look. It's great it's high on thermal mass, so it's really great because it's just basically a thick wall of rammed earth of clay and cement and clay and rock and sand, and so it's absorbing that heat again, absorbing the coolness, and being able to release it. And it can be built to code, which is really cool. All right, we'll move on. There's cordwood. It's round cordwood. Basically, if you think about when you're cutting down trees, the cordwood is the round shape that you normally would put into a fire. But what they do with cordwood is they'll use hardwoods, and they'll store it and they'll dry it for about 2 years, and then they'll use it as a building material. And the main reason why you want to do that is because if cordwood isn't dried, then it'll shrink, and then you'll have holes inside your wall, and you have rodents and bugs and everyone going in. So you really want to make sure that your cordwood that you're using is dry, a minimum of 2 years, or you kind of have to depend on what material you're using. You can use softwoods. People have done it in the Northern California and different areas, but you're more susceptible to bugs and that, because the sugars in there are really, they don't, even when it's dry, the sugars are still there, so the bugs still alive. So you have to treat it, you have to seal it if you are going to use that. Okay, so it can be used with other materials. It can be load bearing. It looks really cool, as you can see here in these pictures. It's just pretty cool looking, very unique. Has a high thermal mass, again, because it's wood and clay or cement and lime, and so it's able to absorb the heat. They'll sometimes do it in layers, as you can see here in this picture on the above. They have the cob and cement or lime on two sides, inside and outside, but in the middle it'll be filled with sawdust, which is really cool. Or you can use it with newspaper or whatever insulation you have. And it can be built to code, which is also really cool. All right, Paja-Reque. This is something, again, that's done more in the tropical areas because it's something that you want to do with thinner walls. But the best example that I found here is this lady on the right, where she's rolling up what looks like a straw and clay big loaf of bread. And what happens is actually that gets wrapped around the stick forms, and then you're able to kind of fill the branches or the bamboo or the stick in between with the straw. So basically, you take long straw or long grasses. It's dry. You roll it into your clay slip or your clay, and then you just form it in between. So you go one direction one way, and then the next row you go direction the other way. And you can kind of see what she's doing there with the shape. And then you cover it, and all of it with clay and straw plaster. It can be used with other materials. It's not load bearing, so you do have to have framing. It's great for hot areas. It's a thin wall, so you have to make sure that's what you're looking for. And it needs to be framed. All right, so we'll move on. There's wattle and daub. So wattle and daub is actually something that's more European style. It's basically the exact same thing as Paja-Reque, except that they use, a lot of times they'll use branches. They'll use willow branches to kind of build the framing around it. There's also the other European styles where it's just really thin lath that you put on, and we call that lath and plaster, which comes from the wattle and daub concept. And you can see some of the old structures on that one on the top right corner. They're filled in between timbers, and they're used really, and it looks really beautiful when it's all said and done. So use straw, wood, or bamboo, or clay, sand, and lime. That's kind of the stuff that's inside the mix. It can be used with other materials. It's not load bearing. It has to have framing. It's great for hot areas or cold areas. You can also do a double wall. So if you do wattle and daub on the outside and then wattle and daub on the inside, and then you again fill it with sawdust, or after you plaster it, you fill it with newspaper or whatever you want to fill it with, that insulative. And then, yes, it needs to be framed. So let's move on. All right, round wood. So timber framing basically is something that has been going on for a long time. So timber framing with round wood is you're taking trees that are from the area, ideally. You're skinning them and you're peeling them, and then you're getting them and using them as your structural component. It could be used with other materials. It is load bearing. It can be used for hot or cold areas. It definitely can be built to code, and the trees need to be dryish. I put dryish because a lot of times, again, to have a fully dry tree sometimes takes almost 2 years. So with roundwood timber framing, you usually cut it in spring, and you'll let it sit till about July, and then you'll start framing with it by July or August. So it's not fully dried. I would say it's probably somewhere around 60 to 70% dry. And then as you finish building, as you finish framing, the timbers will actually shrink and compress itself and lock everything into place. So that's kind of how it's done with the conventional stick framing. A lot of the framing that you buy for the lumber is actually still wet. So and that's the same concept. As it dries, it'll shrink and pull everything tight. Okay, we'll move on. Log homes. Log homes are timbers that are used as walls, can be used with other materials. It is load bearing. It's good for hot and cold areas. It can be built to code. And the trees, again, need to be dryish, but it's the same concept. It doesn't have to be fully dried. It can be 60% dry or 70% dry, and then as it continues to dry, it'll bring and compress the building. It has a high thermal mass. I didn't put that in out of room. It has a high thermal mass. It is a little bit challenging to cool and to heat because the wood doesn't absorb very well. So that's something to consider. All right, let's finish up here. So the conclusion, natural buildings last a long time, as we saw on the slides, but you have to maintain them. It can be built anywhere in the world. Build using materials that are available to you. See how the people of old built and follow their lead, and build for what you need. All right, well, thanks for coming and joining us for this class, and we will see you next class.